Hello and welcome to NewsX. I'm Thomas Porteous and you're watching The Reading List. In this show, we delve into the minds behind some of the most pressing books of our time. Today, we have the pleasure of hosting Dhruva Jaishankar, the Executive Director of the Observer Research Foundation America, an institution he co-founded in 2020. He joins us to discuss his latest book, Vishwashastra, India and the World, which explores India's interaction with the global community from ancient times to the 21st century. Thank you very much for joining us. My first question to you is, what inspired you to write Vishwashastra, and what key messages do you hope readers will take away from it?
I think what inspired me to write it was talking to Indians, particularly young Indians, particularly outside of the capital, Delhi, who were eager to learn a lot more about the world and India's place in it, and didn't really have a place to start. And in some ways, I wrote this as an introductory book. It is meant for somebody who does not know much about international relations, perhaps not much about India. It's just a way to start. So it tells a sort of historical story. It tells a story of India's interactions with the world from ancient times to 2024, to the present day almost. And then the second part of it tells the story of, in some ways, what India's objectives are, its priorities, and how it's trying, as I see it, how it's trying to go about achieving those goals. So I think it's a broad introductory book. It covers a lot of ground, sometimes quite superficially, but that's the purpose.
I was wondering, can you explain to me the meaning behind the title Vishwashastra and how it encapsulates the themes of your book?
So Vishwashastra is from Sanskrit. It means a treatise on the world. And I wanted something that evoked a sense of ambition and timelessness and scope, broad scope. It's both parts of the phrase would be familiar to a lot of readers. Shastra is like used in the Artha Shastra. It's a famous treatise on governance written by Kautilya, an Indian writer from more than 2,000 years ago. And then Vishwa, a lot of people know because of Vishwaguru, Vishwamitra, Vishwabandhu. These are phrases that the Prime Minister, for example, has popularized. So it's in some ways a merging of those two. So I think it was meant to be a kind of a treatise on the world. It sort of explain again, meant to evoke a kind of a sense of scope and ambition. And this in some ways is India's time and understanding how India plays in this increasingly contested world is really what this book is about.
Your book delves into India's historical interactions with the world. Were there any in particular events or periods that you found especially pivotal in shaping India's foreign policy?
So I think there's a fair amount people at least are familiar with some aspects of it. I think, the Mughal period, the British Raj and other things, some of the India's interactions with the world at that time, although I think there's quite a lot that people would discover about those periods as well. But I think two periods that really stood out for me. One is a sort of an ancient Indian interactions, and I think we sometimes underestimate how much, particularly through trade and religion, but even politically and socially, how much India interacted with a very wide scope of the world, from the Mediterranean to Africa, and on to China, and the influences that were there, both ways in some cases, were quite vast and quite intense. So I think there's a lot more scope to study ancient India's interactions with the world and look at it from a sort of political lens rather than simply a cultural lens, which again is much better understood. Secondly, I think there's a lot to be done in early modern India, roughly the period from about 1700 to 1857. This is basically in some ways after the Mughal supremacy in the subcontinent was started to erode, and culminating, of course, with the British Raj, the establishment of the British Raj in 1858. So that period also saw a lot of jostling for power amongst very, very potent and capable Indian states, the Marathas, Mysore, the Sikhs in Punjab, and also involved external powers as well, the British, French, Ottomans, Russians, and others. So this was a period of great contestation, and yet for people who follow international relations, that's not a period that's been particularly well researched and understood. So I think in pre-independent history, I think those two periods stand out as being ripe for for further study by Indian scholars and analysts.
What do you identify as the most significant challenges India faced in establishing its foreign policy after gaining independence?
Well, the two immediate challenges that Indian leaders had to confront, one was territorial integrity, the accession of the princely states, including Hyderabad, Junagadh, Jammu and Kashmir, but also creating buffer zones with Tibet, because after China's annexation of Tibet in 1950, and then dealing with the periphery, dealing with, so that was, I think, one challenge, territorial integrity. A second was development and how India would work with particularly the developed world, initially the United States, UK, West Germany, but then also the Eastern Bloc subsequently in Japan, and how it would use these relationships to advance and accelerate its own modernization with mixed results. And I try to talk quite candidly about some things that worked. They're very positive effects, such as the establishment of the IITs and the Green Revolution in the 1960s. And yet there were also many ways in which India did not sufficiently take advantage of these relationships. So I think those were the two primary challenges. And then immediately also India had to confront a number of other things, which is competition with Pakistan for resources and prestige and territory, competition with China, which culminated in the 1962 border war, and then also some issues related to the neighborhood, its status in the nuclear order. So these were also some concerns in the immediate wake of independence.
In your book, you highlight India's quest for technological mastery since independence. How do you assess India's progress in sectors like defense, nuclear, space, and computing technologies?
So, again, it's been very mixed. And I think, again, I've tried to provide a sort of candid overview until the present day of areas where India did make some very significant strides. Sometimes it was not always linear. I think the space program is a very good example of that, which is, a very low cost and under very adverse circumstances, India has established a very competitive space program. I also give examples such as, again, on agriculture, on infrastructure, on telecom, on software, where, again, many of the benefits are there to be seen today. Yet there are many other areas where India did not do that. On the nuclear front, I think it was very half-baked, or very belated efforts at normalizing India's nuclear program, which again paid dividends on the military side, but was insufficient on the civilian side. And it's only actually in the past few days that now a pledge has been made by the government to open up the nuclear industry and make it more attractive to investors for civilian nuclear energy. Defense as well, the picture is very mixed. On the one hand, India made some very important strides in building up a defense industrial base, and yet was not, proved not very competitive in export markets. And so again, it's only recent changes in the past 10 years that have allowed India to become something of a defense exporter again in a few areas. So it's I think a very checkered history. It was not as if the intent was not there, but in terms of execution on electronics defense, semiconductors, again, very belated efforts have been made now. On nuclear, it has not always kept pace with where it should be. But again, there are many other positive developments that I think India can draw inspiration from and learn from the lessons of what it did well at various points of time.
The concept of non-alignment has been central to India's foreign policy. How do you see this evolving in the current global context?
So again, I provide a sort of argument on non-alignment, so a more implicit one, but I think one worth stirring, at least worth having a debate around, which is non-alignment began in a certain way after independence and was intended in a certain way by India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, and in some ways, some of its limitations were exposed by 1962 when India went to war with China and found that it didn't have sufficient backing either from the West, from the United States and Western Europe, nor did it have sufficient backing from the Soviet Union, which opted to support China in 1962. So in some ways, I think some of the weaknesses of non-alignment were already exposed. In the second half of the Cold War, India effectively aligned. So despite maintaining the rhetoric of non-alignment, India was effectively aligned with the Soviet Union. And then after 1991, when you had a more unipolar world where the US was dominant and non-alignment cease to become as relevant. So today, I don't think while it again non-alignment I feel is often misunderstood, mischaracterized. It meant different things at different times, and so it's not a very useful term. Certainly, the current government, mostly for political reasons, has not embraced that terminology and doesn't use it in official rhetoric. But I also think it's not analytically a very useful concept at this point of time, because in today's world, the two biggest powers are the U.S. and China, not no longer the U.S. and Russia, U.S. and Soviet Union. And in this case, India and China have certain major differences. So the idea that India can remain truly non-aligned in this context, given its own very significant differences with China and significant competition, regardless of this rivalry between the U.S. and China, means that old idea of non-alignment doesn't really hold much water today.
In what ways do you envision India redefining its role in the emerging world order, especially concerning institutions like the United Nations?
So I think some things have changed. I do encapsulate what some of the major changes have been in India's uh, external interactions since 1991 in particular. It's more integrated with the global economy. It is, it's today the fifth largest economy, possibly soon the third largest economy in the world. It's a nuclear power. It's more integrated into the global nuclear architecture. It's no longer, it's sort of dehyphenated itself from Pakistan to a great degree. It is now has much more acute competition with China, a global power that is on its doorstep. So I think that these circumstances are very different from in the past. And this kind of defines India's, these are some of the circumstances that define India's interactions with the world. And what has happened as a product of all of this is that India today um, has sort of embraced some of the rhetoric of a global power, or at least a rising global power, a potential global power. And this again translates into its ambitions in the BRICS, for example, earlier in the G20 with the Quad. It's now much less hesitant about projecting itself and joining these groupings and working in these groupings of major powers. And again, this will play out in the United Nations Security Council. India has staked out a claim to be a permanent member. It is working with other claimant states, such as what's called the G4, Germany, Brazil, and Japan being the others. This attempt has been frustrated for a few reasons. One is that the current permanent members, particularly China, are not very enthusiastic about this reform. Partly the differences within the developing world about the constitution of any new kind of Security Council. One of the biggest obstacles I think that doesn't get much attention is disagreements in Africa about how to allocate African representation. And so for a lot of these reasons, effectively UN Security Council reform has been stuck. There's been a little bit of progress over the past couple of years, but it's really not moving as fast as many in India would like. But in the grand scheme, I think the idea is that for India to position itself so that if and when such reform happens, India is well placed to make a case for itself. And in the absence of such reform, India is able to support alternative institutions to advance some of the same objectives.
Moving on, how does India balance its strategic autonomy with the need for commitment-based partnerships, particularly with nations like the USA and those in Europe?
Well, I personally think, and I've written about this even previously, which is, the era of commitment-based partnerships is today in question. I mean, Donald Trump, the U.S. president, calls them into question every day almost. And again, there's growing skepticism in Europe about, the appropriateness and wisdom of the NATO alliance. I mean, it still exists, obviously. There's still Article 5, there's still a mutual treaty commitments. Yet, this idea of sort of open-ended commitments, I think, is somewhat passé. And it was largely a product of the immediate post-World War II world and the nuclear age. So I don't think that there's necessarily that dilemma. I think the bigger dilemma, and again, one I get into a little bit, is how do you maintain your autonomy and sovereignty and resilience in this competitive world. And again, we just need to look at the implications of the COVID pandemic for how for why that's important, in the public health sphere, but in many other areas as well. So how do you maintain that resilience and maintain your sovereignty while integrating with the world? And while taking advantage of a more interdependent world. So that I think is a big challenge. I go into it in some extent, both on the defense and in terms of military preparedness and security, but also in terms of in industrial policy, how India can modernize its economy, because we are in an era of competing industrial policies today.
India is often seen as a leader of the global south. How does your book address India's responsibilities and strategies in this regard?
So I think there's an important distinction to be made here. There are many countries that claim to be the leader. I don't personally don't think India should project itself as the leader, partly because I think it will lead to resentment in many other quarters of the global south. But it certainly can position itself as a leader in the global south, and which it has tried to do. And in some ways, it makes a very good case for why India could be certainly one of the more potent and capable leaders in the global south. There are a few reasons for this. I think partly the agenda for the global south, whether it's climate justice, debt sustainability, health, food, or energy security, are all things that India would like to achieve. And so it's not just India advocating for this, but if it has the backing of 100 or 150 other countries, it certainly can carry more weight to advance what are fundamentally Indian interests. So I think that's in some ways why it's important. And again, secondly, I think just we are in this period of a great global rebalancing. And again, the pandemic, and then also the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the aftermath, the sanctions placed on Russia by the West, showed in some ways how vulnerable many countries in the global south were to these geopolitical changes. And there was a widespread feeling in Latin America and Africa and Southeast Asia and the Middle East that they were at the short end of some of the consequences of that, which is and it's their energy security, their food security, their health security were not being sufficiently prioritized. And so this does give an opportunity for India to make its case, but also it's part of geopolitical competition. So I don't think it should be seen purely in ideological terms. This is not, in that sense, it's very different from the non-alignment of the early 1950s, early mid-1950s. This is really about advancing Indian interests in conjunction with many other countries, a very large number of countries that share a lot of those same concerns.
Furthermore, what role does economic diplomacy play in India's foreign policy, and how is it addressed in Vishwashastra?
I think it's integral. Economic and commercial diplomacy is today integral to any kind of diplomacy, and you see this in any. If you look at any official joint statement between India and another country, particularly a developed country, but even developing countries, the bulk of it is really about economic trade. I mean, in the widest sense of things, it's about the movement of people. It's about standard setting. It's about some of it can be quite technical, but that's really what it's about. It's about how are these two countries, India and its partners, helping each other in ways that matter for the two countries. So again, it's about natural resources, critical minerals, technology, trade. Again, it's I think very integral, and that's why the first section of my on the strategy chapter is about Atmanirbhar Bharat, which is how to create a self-sufficient, stronger India, and starts off with military preparedness and industrial policy being integral to that. So I think that's at the core of everything. There are strategic concerns as well. But they build off of that. So it's something, again, as India becomes more globally integrated with the economy, particularly as it has since the 1990s, this has now become central to Indian interactions with the world.
My penultimate question, were there any surprising discoveries or insights you encountered during your research for this book?
I think, so on the insights part, I don't think there was anything new to me. I think it was how to structure it to be as I have 14 priorities that I identify for India. how do you distill it into a handful, in this case, 14 main lines of effort that India needs to be engaged in, without going into too much detail, because there's only so much you can do in a relatively short book. So I think in terms of the insights, there was nothing sort of that I found completely revealing. There were a lot of anecdotes, particularly historical anecdotes that I did not know about going into this, and which I learned along the way. A lot of again very interesting stories, from the Cold War that are relevant today, by the way. And I try to make it as light, make the book as readable and in some ways attractive to a casual reader by including some of these anecdotes, even though they may not be, integral or important to India's current foreign policy in all cases. Sometimes they were still revealing in different ways. So I think in that sense, I learned, a lot about early Indian interactions with the world. Had to go back into a lot of history, very colorful characters who played a role. I think some of the debates in the 1950s and 1960s around India's, there wasn't always unanimity or consensus around major issues. So I think that was, I found a lot of those anecdotes very revealing.
What do you hope both Indian and international readers will gain from Vishwashastra, and how do you envision it contributing to discourse on India's foreign policy?
So, unfortunately, the book is not yet available outside of India. It's been published only by Penguin India. It's available only as an ebook outside. I do hope that more people who are interested in India's role in the world will pick it up, and it does get a wide audience. But the primary audience was in India. And I do hope a few things. One, I think it should just elicit interest on India's role in international affairs. It should get people, even casual readers, just give them a structure to think about the world. Because, again, they see all sorts of items in the news every day. How does it slot into a larger framework, whether it's a historical framework or a strategic framework? And again, I try and give both. I think it's also meant to, there's a widespread view. Well, there's no strategy. There's no, and again, I think I try and show empirically that that's not been the case. That's almost never been the case. That there always has been thinking and debates and actions that India has conducted to position itself in international affairs. I think there are a few other things I would take away from it. One is how much an interest-based foreign policy matters. Both, that is, as a fact, that has often been the guiding principle for India, and as it is for many other countries. And secondly, it is often what serves Indian interests best. And sometimes when ideology is given priority over interests, it has served India poorly. And then I think one other aspect I would take away from this is just the concern. There is sometimes an isolationist bent in people, which is, why do we care about foreign policy? It's some sort of luxury. But I think I try and make the case that it is very integral to people's day-to-day lives, and whether it is the food we eat, whether it is our transportation or our health, whether it is job opportunities and investment and business, in almost every aspect of day-to-day life, it somehow India's interactions with the world do matter and do make a difference. So I do hope that it sort of challenges in some ways some of the complacency around public policy and international relations. It gets Indians to think provocatively about opportunities and challenges outside of the country. So again, I do hope that it helps to shift some of these debates.
Thank you very much for joining us, Dhruva Jaishankar, and congratulations for your book, Vishwashastra, India and the World. We will continue to bring you more such insightful discussions here on NewsX. Thank you for watching.